Hi everybody, Lukas Käll is here. I'm in sunny Stockholm right now. I'm so sorry for not being able to join you, but I got doctor's orders to be stuck here instead of being down together with you. I hope you have a great meeting. I will take the opportunity to try to present my topic even though I couldn't be with you through a recorded presentation. So the title of my talk is Semi-supervised learning for identification in mass spectrometry-based proteomics. And that will take its form in the following outline. Firstly, I will try to discuss high-throughput statistics in as generic frame as possible, and only briefly touch on mass spectrometry at all in the presentation, in that part of the presentation. Then I will move over to the percolator algorithm and try to describe how it works and some of its properties. And then I will talk about the recent adaptation to MSUF Plus of percolator. And finally, I will, time allowing, discuss some proteomics that we recently did. So first, high-throughput statistics. Frequently, we design experiments where we want to determine different population parameters. Typically, we do this from putting out a sample out of the population, perform a measurement on this particular sample. We then need a statistical model in order to describe the errors of this measurement process. And the final outcome of this should be some kind of inference, that is a conclusion regarding the population parameter. Most frequently we design studies, or a very frequent used type of study is where we compare two different types of populations and see whether a certain feature differs between the populations. Once again, this is performed by picking out samples out of the different populations and making a statistical model regarding the properties of the differences of the observed means. And we want to make an inference that is a conclusion regarding the difference between the population means. A frequent employed vehicle for doing so is to do different type of hypothesis tests. Typically, we design a null hypothesis, and that should be the situation that we're not interested in. This could be that the differences between the population parameters is non-existing, actually that there's no particular difference in the trait that we're measuring. To contrast that, we look on an alternative hypothesis, that is the situation we are interested to detect, and that is that there is actually an underlying difference between the populations that we have observed in the samples, and that will describe the differences in the samples that we have measured on. We normally refer to this as the null hypothesis and the alternative hypothesis, H0 and H1, or H0 and H1. The by far most frequent way that we measure or make our inferences is the so-called p-value. And this is that we observe a difference between the sample population that's as big or bigger than the current observed difference, given that there is actually no difference between the populations. A great thing with p-values are that they are uniformly distributed under the null hypothesis. That is, that it's just as equal that this probability should be 1 as it should be 0, given that there is no difference under the null hypothesis. So that's how things look when we study one single variable at a time. Sometimes we're interested in measuring many different traits at the same time. That is, that we're interested in multiple different population parameters. Under such conditions, we can make the same type of reasoning. That is, we can design, we can pick out samples, and we can make a statistical model that describe the differences between each individual measurement. And in the end, we want to make inferences concluding or conclusions regarding the differences in population mean for each individual trait that we're interested in. So, is this different from the situation before? Yes and no. It's actually, we can still employ things like p-values, etc. But there's just this effect of the fact that we observe more than one trait at a time. The probabilities behave a little bit different. If you look on enough variables, very unlikely unlikely events become quite plausible. And I think this is best illustrated by this t-shirt text that I recently saw on the street. If you are 1 in a million, there are probably 7,000 people just like you. The joke here is, of course, that the seemingly improbable suggestion as being 1 in a million actually becomes a quite plausible event if you instead regard the whole world population. The world population is currently 7 billion people. So this actually leads to some problems with the p-value as a statistic, because something that looks very improbable when you look on it on the level of an individual education, say a p-value of 0.05, that all of a sudden can become quite probable when you regard multiple statistics at the same time, or multiple different tests at the same time. When we look over an average of 20 different measurements, all of a sudden you would almost expect there to be something that's as unlikely as just 5% of the cases. What can we do instead then? Well, one of the most common used tricks is to regard something that's called a false cover rate. But in order to come to that, we actually need to explain something about threshold strategies as well. Say that we are able to sort our identification according to p-value. So the most likely to be correct of the identifications are put on top of the list, and the least likely on the bottom of the list. At some point of this list, we can sort of do this threshold, and we could then clear all the p-values above this threshold to be correct identifications, and all the p-values below this to be incorrect identifications. If we follow such a procedure, we must be able to define what we call the false discovery rate. That is the expected value of the fraction of tests below this particular threshold that are generated on a null hypothesis. That is to say, how many of those hypotheses or all this p-value above this would we expect to be generated on a null hypothesis just by chance. So here's a purely fictive example here where we have sort of somebody told us that 2 of those 10 above threshold are incorrect, and hence we could expect the expectation value of the hypothesis generated on null hypothesis to be 20%, and hence the FDR could be estimated to 20%. So how can we do this in practice? Normally, people don't tell us what tests are correct and which are incorrect, or which tests are generated on null hypothesis and which are generated on alternative hypothesis. One of the great tricks that we use, first described by Story et al., or Story and Tushirani in PNAS 2003, is that we actually can take this property of p-values that are uniformly distributed and make use of that. So all the null hypotheses will be evenly distributed at the same height, and I illustrated here this as a red area in this graph here. Here I think about this as a histogram of all p-values from a high-throughput experiment. And now you would expect the p-values to amass towards the lower range, because the ones generating alternative hypotheses are frequently a lower p-value. whereas the ones generated on null hypothesis are evenly distributed, as we said before. So in the false discovery rate then of this plot here becomes just this red area divided by the red plus the green area. And this will be our estimation of the false discovery rate. So I think up to this point, I haven't tried to describe the false discovery rate here in terms that don't necessarily involve anything about models that we as mass spectrometers want to use, such as decoy model, etc. False discovery rates are just a property of a list with a threshold. As long as you can define a null hypothesis, then and that you can score your identifications, then there are such things as a false discovery rate for that list. Don't let anybody else tell you something different. More than the false discovery rate, there are some other interesting measures that one can use as well. There are, for instance, the Q value, which is the minimal false discovery rate out of all thresholds, or the false discovery rate of any list that is threshold by thresholds that includes the current identification. We as well got the posterior error probability, also known as the local false discovery rate, and that is the probability that an identification with score X is generated on a null hypothesis. And of course, we got the p-value still. However, this is best used for any experiment where we only have one single trait measured at the same time. So, with this in our luggage, now we can start to approach the problem of peptide identifications. This is, as you know, the far most efficient way to analyze the protein contents of biological mixtures. We take our proteins, digest them with trypsin into short-length peptides. We separate them chromatically, we call them, and inject them into mass spectrometer, which measures a set of spectra. The way we do inferences in this system is that we simulate the process by taking the database containing all the amino acid sequence of the proteins that we are expecting to turn up in the protein, and we simulate which peptide they will give rise to and which theoretical spectra they will obtain. We then end up matching this reality with the experiment that we obtain. The by far most used mean or program to do so is by applying what we call search engines. So a search engine take a spectrum, an observed spectrum that is, and compare it to all the theoretical spectra of a certain target database. And normally we only keep the top scoring PSM for each spectrum. So we end up with a list of top scoring PSMs, that is their spectrum, the peptide, and the score. The null hypothesis that's been popularly used is that the peptide is incorrectly matched to the spectrum. And we can use this to derive false discovery rates. And as I'm sure you're all aware about as well, we can employ this very smart trick that we can actually calculate false discovery rates directly from using decoy database. Here we are using an assumption that decoy identification are good proxies for incorrect target identifications. And we can often make this happen by various tricks. It's just to see that the amino acid composition, etc., is similar between target and decoy database, and that we concatenate them before searching, etc., etc. This is well described in literature, but first out doing this was Moore et al. And Peng et al. Just after the millennium shift. So it's important to see as well that all these measures, they become very different depending on what kind of entity we are measuring. A couple of years ago, we almost uniformly in the field reported what's known as the peptide spectrum matches. That is the match between the peptides and spectra. There's a many-to-many relationship between spectra and peptides. Hence, we call because they're just so that some peptides are fragmented multiple times, and you obtain multiple spectra for them. Similarly, not shown in this plot here, there are multiple. There could be multiple peptide species in some with the same individual spectrum. We call such spectra chimeric spectra. Similar, there's many-to-many relationship between proteins and peptides as well. We have multiple peptides that just stem from the same protein. And due to homology, there's some peptides are shared between different proteins. All this leads to the statistics turning out a little bit different on PSM level, peptide level, and protein level. In general speaking, whatever false discovery rate you have on PSM level will become even higher on peptide level and even higher on protein level. And that's just to the inert structure of the data. I forgot to mention as well, actually there's perhaps we'll have to look on the null model a little bit differently for those different experiments. Whether it's the PSM being incorrect, being the null model of PSM level, the peptide not being present could be another null model for on peptide level, and on protein level we have to adopt the null model quite a lot to the different protein inference procedures we're using. But given a correctly used inference procedure, we could still say that one could use methods similar to target decoy competition to deduce protein level false discovery rates. Now over to the percolator algorithm. This is a quite old story by now. We presented this 2007, and it stems from my postdoc years in Bill Noble's lab in Seattle at the University of Washington. And we collaborated quite heavily together with Mike McCaws, which as well as the senior author on this paper. The reason why I bring this story up now is actually that there are quite a number of efforts have been directed towards integrating percolator into the OpenMS platform. I'm very pleased by that development, but when I just try to give you a couple of background facts here about percolator. So the onset of using percolator was at the time when we started planning this experiment was we had this problem of the search engine Sequest. It reported multiple different scores, and there were different schemes of how to weight those different scores to each other in order to determine whether an identification was correct or incorrect. And sometimes this involved as well other parameters like the toxicity of the peptide, if it was a long or short peptide or not, etc., etc. And we just thought that, well, actually, it would be nice to combine all those different scores into one single score. And this thing, to combine things, or to combine multiple different features into one single score, that's machine learning. That's what machine learning does for breakfast, right? We all do different feature combinations, and we want to make them optimal. So what kind of data do we got for this? Here I made a couple of color histograms explaining the nature of the different identifications we got. And here I used the Sequest X score here on the x-axis, and which is the main score from coming out from Sequest, and as well the second most informative score, the delta-CN score here on the y-axis. And to your left, you see the target distribution of the target peptide spectrum matches, and to the right, the decoy peptide spectrum matches. I used the color code so that white means that's an area that where no peptides was observed, blue some peptides, and red means quite a number of peptides in this particular area. what I want you to note here with this image is that actually the same distribution as we got of our decoy PSMs here, this little bun, it actually reoccurs as well inside of the distribution of target PSMs. We see the same little bun here, but as well accompanied with a shark fin here sticking out from it, consisting of potentially the correct identifications, that is the identification we're looking for. So the question is how to use this kind of data as training data. Well, the first naive approach we took was actually to just use this as training data right away, plus and use this as plus and minus set, or a positive and negative training set. However, we found a couple of better workarounds, and people have priorly used curated data sets, so they have handpicked PSMs that they see as correct, and others that they saw as incorrect, and they trained different machine learning algorithms. Anderson et al. Did a support vector machine. Käll et al. Used a linear regressor to train a ultimate separator between those two different classes. But we thought instead that we should use different type of algorithm known as semi-supervised learning, or self-trainers. So a self-trainer here, in this case, means that we actually could regard all our decoy PSMs as incorrect identifications. Remember now, the decoy PSMs are as good as guaranteed to be incorrect. They're generated from what we design as our empirical null model. Hence, there are examples of incorrect identifications. We can see that, shortly see those as negatively labeled. We simply don't know if the target PSMs are correct or incorrect. So now we could use any of the scores here to start to threshold identifications. So say that we use the X score here first. We could now threshold all our PSMs to a level where we reach a Q value or false discovery rate of 1%. And if we use this threshold, that is to say that there's 100 times more correct identifications to the left here than in the square to the right here. If you use this threshold now, we could now just block off our identifications and just filter out the target PSMs above this threshold. Once that we're equipped with a set that mostly consists of correct identifications, 99% correct identifications, and a set only consists of negative identifications or incorrect identifications, decoys. Given this, we can train, in our case, we choose a linear support vector machine to design a better scoring function that will optimally combine now the X score and delta CN parameter for this the given data set, or given training set, I mean. This will give us an increased number of education above the score threshold. Of course, we will be pleased by seeing this increase, but as soon as we've done that, the intelligent audience here realized that actually we could use this as a new threshold for designing an even better training set here. So we take a new set of target PSMs and match them and train them against a set of decoys. In fact, we can do this over and over again until we converge. And this is what we call the percolator algorithm. And we set a set of target PSMs, or an increasingly growing set of target PSMs, and use as a positive training set. Well, we use all our decoy PSMs as our negative training features. In the original article, we used a set of 17 different features, all stemming from sequest, whereof some of them were direct reported from the program, and some of them were calculated by hand. And they would typically be different type of scores coming from sequest, and different precursor mass features reported by sequest. But as well, we used peptide sequence features and the charge states, etc. So this led at the time to a phenomenal increase in the number of peptide spectrum matches we could get out of a set. Here's an example where we roughly see twice as many PSMs on the same score threshold using raw sequenced, or using sequence with a combination of percolator as compared to using just bare bone sequenced. The plot here I show as here I used the number of PSMs on the y-axis and the Q value on the x-axis. This the sweet spot of this plot would of course be in the top left corner, where we have as many PSMs as possible. So actually, why do we obtain this kind of almost extreme type of performance increase using this algorithm? I would say that there's two main reasons for this. And one is that which is the obvious one, that actually by looking on all those different features, we in some way build in novel dimensions to our data. We look on information as orthogonal to all the information from spectra. In some respects, orthogonal. But actually, there's one that's even I consider as more important to this performance increase, and that's what I call the spectral score covariation. So what I mean with this is, well, I will start off here just describing this as a couple of cartoons. So say that we plot for each spectrum that we obtained the score for. We plotted its top score against the target database versus its score against the decoy database on the y-axis. So what kind of separation do we sort of prefer to obtain here? Would we prefer a scenario like the one here to the left, where we got a clear separation between correct and incorrect PSMs? It's just that we, for some spectra, we obtained a higher score than others? Or would we as well require them to be separated just in one axis at a time? That is, would we prefer them to be separated against the score against the target database? Actually, the answer is that we prefer the one where we got the score that separated against on the score against the target database solely. Really, to see why this is the case is just that we normally threshold against the score against the target database, and if that separation don't lead to a separation between correct and incorrect identifications, we are in some way we will have a hard time then to weed out the correct from the incorrect ones. So how does those plots actually look for when you look on real data? Well, here I plotted now for the same data sets our score from the X score from the decoy database and the X score from the target database for both sequenced on left and percolated to the right. Color codes as before here. And as you might observe, there's a large correlation here between the score against the target database and the decoy database for sequenced, where there's no such trend, or not as big as such a trend, is observable for percolator. This makes it much easier for the end user to threshold the scores. And that's, in effect, this is sort of led us to training away something that was a clear bias or a clear covariate in the scoring procedure of sequenced. So you see here on the sequenced identifications to the left, there's some scores that will score a very low score regardless of them being correct or incorrect. They will still be down in the left corner there, the lower left corner. Some identifications or some spectra, they will obtain a high score regardless of them being correct or incorrect. There is one up on the diagonal to the top right corner there, or along the diagonal in the top part of the spectrum. So that means that some spectra will, even though they're being completely correct matched, not be able to, you won't be able to threshold them using normal threshold techniques. Okay, let's move over to something different here. And here's about a recent adaptation of percolator to MSGF+. So this MSGF+ you might know as the scoring engine by scientist Kim from PNLL. Did this during his time in Paul Pevsner's lab in San Diego. But Sankt has since then moved over to PNLL. So the challenge here is that MSGF+ actually have been designed very much in this problems of spectral covariation and consideration, even though they don't express it the same way as I do. And you can actually see that there's by far less covariation in MSGF+ than it was in, for instance, Sequest. Would this still lead to increased performance using percolator? This integration was made by a PhD student in my lab at the time, Victor Granholm, who since this moved on and worked at Spotify right now, looking at how to best increase the revenue of Spotify. So this was done work done between collaboration between Victor and Sankte at PNL at the time. So we used the percolator algorithm to optimally combine different scores and features stemming out from MSGF+. So on top of the scores reported from MSGF+ originally, we as well took the time to design a couple of new scores. So we used in total 22 different features to describe a PSM. These include a couple of scores as reported from Sequest, and as well as different ion currents that we or summed ion currents in different kinds, different mass features, different fragment mass errors, and different enzyme specificity features. So, employing this on different features, we actually could determine a clear difference here between just using MSGF+ and a percolator as compared to using just barebone or the original Cruxbus percolator or Sequest percolator, that is. So I once again use a PQ plot. This time I use number of peptides about threshold on the y-axis, and I plot this versus the Q value. That's roughly the false discovery rate of the current threshold. So at the 1% false discovery rate, we find 7% more peptides than with MSGF+. We're pretty happy about that. It's sort of we thought that the Sequest percolator or Cruxbus percolator would be very hard to beat marked before, but the new combination with MSGF+ actually renders much more identifications. Even more remarkably is that we could find 20% more phospholipeptides using MSGF+ percolator as compared to using Cruxbus percolator. So there we could clearly see a benefit of using MSGF+ instead of barebone Sequest. So now let's move over to something a little bit different. It's about human proteomics. And this is a story about how we did 6-frame translation searches against the human genome with mass spec data. This is work that we did in collaboration with Jan Lech's lab, formerly a postdoc in his lab, Rue Branca, did a couple of isoelectric focusing experiments. So the downside is that they had priorly decided, or Jan's lab has priorly designed this type of high resolution isoelectric focusing experiment that they call HIREF. Basically, you take your peptide mixture stemming from trypsin digestion, and you separate those peptides based on their isoelectric points. You then have a good pipetting robot that could extract in a very precise manner the different PI ranges. And the original experiment was that they tried now to search this against normal database and in order to obtain better PSMs. This is a great technique because you can do complexity reduction here. Compared to the very many peptides that we had originally, injecting into mass spectrometer, we get a clearly reduction of complexity compared to this very highly complex sample in each individual of those cutouts. However, when we looked at this procedure, we realized that there's actually more to be done here. We could optimize this design as well by actually restricting our peptides by doing isoelectric point prediction. Isoelectric point prediction can be made by various algorithms. We had an in-house algorithm for doing this. So in this case, we can not just reduce the complexity of the sample prior to inject it into the mass spectrometer, we can as well reduce the complexity of the database that we search against. You might ask yourself, why is this useful at all? Well, it's just this fact that the average score of the top coherence PSMs are increasing with the database size. And this is a property that is not shared by correct target PSMs. So correct identifications are the same or obtain the same kind of score regardless of database size, but the incorrect ones will generally increase. So just to illustrate this, Victor Granholm some time ago plotted this the highest X score you could obtain against a decoy database as a function of the number of peptides in the decoy database. And as you see, this is a steadily increasing function of the database size. This is by no means stranger than for saying that the tallest man of China is probably taller than the tallest man of Sweden, or Germany for that sake as well. Simply, if we have a bigger set to pick out of, or a bigger set to pick a candidate from, the max will always be a little bit higher in the bigger set than the smaller set. So, when we consider applications like 6' translation searches, which are commonly used, for instance, in bacterial genomes that are not that complex and are quite limited in size, they've always been feasible due to the fact that there are not that many different peptides stemming from such a search. On a human genome, on the other hand, this is not true anymore. The number of peptides stemming out from a full 6' translation of the human genome become gigantic. I've chosen to illustrate this here in what we call Sun-Earth plot here. So if we would just plot the size of the number of tryptic peptides, it will sort of stemming from 6' translation. It will take this huge space here of this orange blob here that we got, that we even couldn't fit into the slide. Actually compared by the search space about a typical database search, which will be this light blue dot here instead. However, by considering only search space of this tryptic peptide, we get this medium-sized blue Earth-like shape here in front of. Just a little bit bigger than the database size of the human proteome as defined by the sample. This is of course a huge relief when we try to search our data. And actually we made this work pretty well in our hands, and we could use so we did this for large collection spectra. We made 50 million AMS2 spectra, which stemmed or resulted in a set of 3 million PSMs, and which correspond to 77,000 different unique peptides from total 10,000 different human genes. In those set of genes, we actually could fish out a couple of priorly unexpected things that come out as well. We, for instance, discovered 100 novel protein-coded loci, whereof 48 were refined models of known proteins. So, for instance, extensions of an exon or N-terminal extensions. Another 50 resurrected pseudogenes, etc. Here should be noted, though, that this was made from stem cell line, or sorry, from a cell line. So it could be questions here exactly how human those different genes really are. Anyway, the conclusions here. The percolator algorithm, it uses the decoys as negative training samples, and it iteratively defines a set of target PSMs as positive training samples. Perfectly greatly increase the yield of existing search engines. And if we replace seq with MSCF+, we can obtain an even better yield with percolator. And if we use predictions of pre-fractionation separation, we can greatly increase the sensitivity of shotgun proteomics, so that we can, to the point that we even can enable 6-frame translation searches against the human genome. Let me end this presentation with yet another proverb. In this case, it's a proverb that Mark Twain claimed that Benjamin Disraeli uttered. Benjamin Disraeli was a prime minister, a British prime minister during the late 19th century. And he supposedly has said that there are 3 kinds of lies. There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. As of course one of those, at first it looks like one of those awkward statements about statistics done by ignorant people. But then it struck me when I started to think about this that Benjamin Disraeli actually lived on a time long before the works of Roland Fisher and Gossets, etc. were known. And it's actually, statistics probably have a completely different meaning at that time. And if we really want to understand what he supposedly has said, is we should instead look up something different. So, like, there are 3 kinds of lies. There are lies, damn lies, and average of measurements. I think that's a pretty much better statement all of a sudden. Actually, if you just do average of measurements, you are missing out on all the statistical properties of your measurement process. And I hope that you instead think something different in general about science. And I would hope that you will say is that there are 3 kinds of lies. There's lies, damn lies, and measurements without or incorrect statistical analysis. So with that, I like to thank a couple of people. Here's a picture from my lab where I actually only mentioned the work of Victor Granholm, but there are other very important contributions by other people as well. I'd like to thank Mike Macaas and Bill Noble at University of Washington, John Story at Princeton, and Jan Löchter's lab at Karolinska, as well as Dick Smith and Sankta Kim at PNL. All these being involved in the stories I happen to tell here. Of course, I have numbers of other collaborators that I will unfortunately not mention right now. Here's my funding source as well, and if you want to check out Percolator, there's copies to download from percolator.com. And I would sincerely thank you for giving me yet another opportunity to present this. I can assure you guys that I would much rather be with you. It's much better to be healthy and in Berlin than being ill in Stockholm. So thank you.